Sarah Miller had always been a morning person. Every day at 6 a.m. she would walk out of her small ranch house with a cup of coffee in her hand and smile at the peaceful view around her. 3 acres of green grass, a small red barn, and rolling hills in the distance made her feel like she was living in a postcard. She had saved for years to buy this little piece of heaven, and for 3 wonderful years it had been her perfect escape from the busy world. But this Thursday morning was different. Very different. Sarah opened her front door and nearly dropped her coffee mug. Her long gravel driveway, which usually stretched empty from her house to the main road, was completely packed with fancy cars. Not just 1 or 2 cars, but 8 expensive vehicles lined up like they owned the place. A shiny black BMW sat right at the entrance to her property. Behind it, a silver Mercedes blocked the path to her barn. An Audi, a Lexus, and several other cars she couldn't even identify filled every inch of her driveway. "What in the world?" Sarah said out loud, looking around in confusion. She couldn't get her old pickup truck out. She couldn't drive to the barn to feed her horses. She couldn't even walk down her own driveway without squeezing between the cars. These vehicles had turned her private property into a parking lot, and she had no idea who they belonged to. Sarah put down her coffee and walked toward the cars, hoping to find some clue about their owners. The vehicles were all spotless and expensive, the kind that cost more than most people made in a year. She peeked through the windows but saw nothing helpful. No notes, no phone numbers, no explanation for why her driveway had become a luxury car show. As she stood there scratching her head, Sarah heard a familiar voice from next door. Margaret Henderson was standing in her perfectly manicured garden, watering her roses with a fancy copper watering can. Margaret was the kind of woman who always looked like she was ready for a magazine photo shoot, even at 6:30 in the morning. Her gray hair was perfectly styled, her makeup was flawless, and her garden outfit probably cost more than Sarah's entire wardrobe. Margaret had moved into the big house next door about 8 months ago. Within a week of moving in, she had gotten herself elected as the new president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. Sarah's property sat just outside the HOA boundaries, which meant she didn't have to follow their strict rules about grass height, fence colors, and holiday decorations. But that didn't stop Margaret from treating Sarah like she was part of her kingdom. "Margaret," Sarah called out, walking toward the fence that separated their properties. "Do you know anything about these cars in my driveway?" Margaret looked up from her roses with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She was the type of person who could make a simple good morning sound like an insult. "Oh, hello, Sarah," she said in her sweet but cold voice. "Yes, those are my guest cars. I hope they're not causing too much trouble." Sarah blinked in surprise. "Your guests? Margaret, they're blocking my entire driveway. I can't get my truck out. I can't get to my barn. I can't even get to my own mailbox." Margaret continued watering her roses as if Sarah was complaining about something as minor as loud music. "Well, my daughter Jessica is getting married this weekend. Tonight is the rehearsal dinner, and we simply don't have enough parking space for everyone. Your driveway was the perfect solution." "The perfect solution?" Sarah's voice got a little higher. "Margaret, you can't just use my driveway as a parking lot without asking me first. This is my private property." Margaret finally looked directly at Sarah, and her expression was as cold as ice water. "Oh, Sarah, don't be so dramatic. It's just for one evening. The cars will be moved eventually." "Eventually? When exactly is eventually? I have animals to feed. I have work to do. I need to be able to use my own driveway." Margaret let out a little laugh that sounded more like a snort. "Sarah, dear, you live out here in the middle of nowhere like some kind of hermit. Surely you can wait one day to do your farm chores. My daughter's wedding is much more important than whatever little projects you have planned." Sarah felt her face getting hot. She had always tried to be a good neighbor to Margaret, despite the woman's constant complaints about everything from Sarah's old pickup truck to the way her horses sometimes got close to the fence line. But this was going way too far. "Margaret, I'm not asking you to cancel your daughter's wedding. I'm asking you to move the cars off my property. There has to be somewhere else they can park." "Like where?" Margaret asked, now sounding annoyed. "The street? Do you want my distinguished guests to park on the street like common people? These are important people, Sarah. Doctors, lawyers, business owners. They deserve better than street parking." "Then they can park in your driveway." My driveway is already full with the family cars. Besides, your driveway is longer and can fit more vehicles. It's really the most practical solution." Sarah took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Margaret, I understand that you need parking for your guests. But you should have asked me first. You can't just take over my property without permission." Margaret's fake smile disappeared completely. "Sarah, I am the HOA president. I am used to solving problems and making decisions that benefit the community. Your little driveway isn't being used for anything important anyway. You should feel honored that such distinguished people are gracing your property." Honored? Sarah could hardly believe what she was hearing. I should feel honored that strangers are blocking me from using my own land? Don't be so selfish, Margaret snapped. It's one evening. One small inconvenience for you, but it means everything to my family. Besides, what else do you have to do out here? Feed your horses? Water your garden? These things can wait. Sarah stared at Margaret in shock. She had known her neighbor was entitled and controlling, but this was beyond anything she had imagined. Margaret actually believed she had the right to take over other people's property just because she was the HOA president. She thought Sarah's life and needs were less important than her daughter's wedding party. "Margaret, those cars need to be moved. Now." "Or what?" Margaret asked with a mean smile. "What are you going to do about it, Sarah? Call the police? They'll just tell you it's a neighbor dispute and suggest you work it out like adults? Sue me? Good luck with that. I know several excellent lawyers who would be happy to help me." Sarah realized that Margaret had planned this whole thing. She had deliberately used Sarah's driveway because she knew Sarah lived alone and wouldn't be able to do much about it. Margaret thought she could push her quiet neighbor around just because she held some position of power in the HOA. But Margaret had made one big mistake. She had no idea what Sarah was capable of when someone pushed her too far. Sarah had grown up on a ranch, dealing with difficult animals and even more difficult people. She knew how to handle bullies, whether they had 4 legs or 2. "You're right, Margaret," Sarah said quietly. "I probably can't make you move those cars right now. But I want you to remember something. Those cars are on my property. That means anything that happens to them while they're here is really not my problem." Margaret laughed. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm just stating facts," Sarah replied. "Have a nice day, Margaret. I hope your rehearsal dinner goes exactly as planned." As Sarah walked back to her house, she could hear Margaret muttering angrily behind her. But Sarah was no longer listening. She was thinking about her 3 dogs who were currently locked in their pen near the barn. Rex, Luna, and Buddy were good dogs, but they were also very protective of their territory. And they absolutely loved meeting new people, especially when those new people were dressed in fancy clothes. Sarah looked at the expensive cars in her driveway and smiled for the first time that morning. Margaret wanted to play games? Fine. Sarah could play games too, and she had 3 furry allies who were about to make this rehearsal dinner much more interesting than anyone had planned. Sarah walked back into her house, her hands shaking with anger. She had never been so insulted in her entire life. Margaret's words kept playing in her head like a broken record. "You should feel honored. Don't be so selfish. Your little driveway isn't being used for anything important anyway." She poured herself another cup of coffee and sat at her kitchen table, staring out the window at the cars that had invaded her property. 8 expensive vehicles sat there like they belonged, their owners probably still sleeping peacefully in their hotel rooms, completely unaware that they had ruined someone's entire day. Sarah picked up her phone and called the non-emergency police number. She explained the situation to the dispatcher, trying to keep her voice calm and professional. The woman on the phone was sympathetic, but not very encouraging. "Ma'am, since the cars are on your private property and you haven't spoken directly to each car owner, this is really a civil matter. We can send an officer out to document the situation, but unless the cars are blocking a public road or emergency access, there's not much we can do right away. So strangers can just park on my land and there's nothing you can do about it. The officer can try to mediate the situation, but ultimately you might need to resolve this neighbor to neighbor. An officer should be out within the next few hours." Sarah hung up feeling even more frustrated. She looked at the clock on her microwave. It was only 7:30 a.m. and already her day was completely ruined. She needed to feed her horses, check on her chickens, and get to her part-time job at the local veterinary clinic by noon. But with her driveway blocked, she was trapped on her own, property like a prisoner. By 9 a.m., Sarah heard car doors slamming outside. She looked out her window to see more expensive cars arriving. A white Cadillac squeezed in next to the BMW. A red sports car somehow fit between two SUVs. Margaret's driveway and the area in front of her house were starting to look like a luxury car dealership. Sarah watched as well-dressed people got out of the new cars, laughing and chatting as they walked toward Margaret's house. They stepped right across Sarah's property line like it was their own personal walkway, trampling her flower bed and leaving footprints in her freshly watered garden. Around 10 a.m., Sarah decided to try talking to some of the car owners directly. She walked outside and approached a middle-aged man in an expensive suit who was getting a garment bag out of his trunk. "Excuse me," Sarah said politely. "I'm Sarah, and this is my property. I was wondering if you could move your car so I can get my truck out of my garage." The man looked at her like she was speaking a foreign language. "Oh, we're guests of the Henderson family. Margaret said we could park here." "Is there a problem?" "Well, yes, actually. You're blocking my driveway, and I can't get my vehicle out." The man looked annoyed, like Sarah was being unreasonable. "Look, lady, I don't know what to tell you. Margaret said this was where we should park. Maybe you should talk to her." He grabbed his garment bag and walked away, leaving Sarah standing there with her mouth open. Sarah tried talking to 3 more car owners over the next hour. Each conversation went the same way. They all acted like she was the problem, like she was being difficult for wanting to use her own driveway. One woman actually rolled her eyes and said, "It's just for one day. Can't you just relax?" By 11 a.m., Sarah was beyond frustrated. She called the veterinary clinic and explained that she couldn't get to work because her driveway was blocked. Her boss, Dr. Martinez, was understanding but not happy. "Sarah, I need you here by 1 p.m. at the latest. We have 3 surgeries scheduled this afternoon." "I'll figure something out," Sarah promised, though she had no idea how. Around noon, a police officer finally arrived. Officer Johnson was a kind man in his 50s who listened patiently as Sarah explained the situation. He walked down the driveway taking notes and photos. "This is definitely a frustrating situation," he said. "Technically, these cars are trespassing on your property, but since the owners were told they could park here by your neighbor, and since they're not blocking any public access, it's complicated." Officer Johnson went next door to talk to Margaret. Sarah could hear raised voices through the thin walls, but she couldn't make out the words. 20 minutes later, the officer came back looking tired. "I spoke with Mrs. Henderson. She maintains that this is just a neighborly parking arrangement and that you're being unreasonable. She said the cars will be moved after the rehearsal dinner. Tonight." "Tonight? Officer, I need to get to work. I have animals that need to be fed. This is my home, not a public parking lot." "I understand, ma'am, I really do. But unless you want to press charges for trespassing against each individual car owner, my hands are tied. The best advice I can give you is to try to work this out with your neighbor." After the officer left, Sarah sat on her front porch feeling defeated. She called Dr. Martinez again and explained that she still couldn't get to work. This time he was less understanding. "Sarah, if you can't get here by 2 p.m., I'll have to call in someone else. I can't run a veterinary clinic without staff." Sarah felt tears of frustration burning her eyes. She was going to lose a day's pay, maybe even her job, because of Margaret's selfish behavior. She looked at her horses in the back pasture, probably wondering why they hadn't been fed their morning hay yet. Her chickens were making unhappy noises in their coop. Around 1 p.m., more cars started arriving. Sarah watched from her window as Margaret's backyard filled with people. Caterers carried in boxes of food and flowers. A DJ set up speakers and a sound system. Everyone was laughing and having a wonderful time, completely oblivious to the fact that they had ruined Sarah's entire day. 2 p.m. Sarah tried one more time to reason with Margaret. She found her neighbor directing the caterers, looking elegant in a blue dress and pearls. "Margaret, please, I'm begging you. I've lost a day of work because of this. My animals haven't been fed. Can't some of these cars be moved to the street?" "Margaret, looked at Sarah like she was an annoying child. "Sarah, I've already explained this to you. These are important people. They deserve better than street parking. The rehearsal dinner starts at 6 p.m. and will be over by 10 p.m. You can wait a few more hours." "A few more hours, Margaret. It's been 8 hours already." "Don't be so dramatic," Margaret said with a wave of her hand. "You act like this is the end of the world. It's just one day." "Just one day? This is my life, Margaret. I have responsibilities, I have a job, I have animals depending on me." Margaret's expression turned cold and mean. "Maybe if you had chosen to live in a normal neighborhood instead of playing farmer out here in the middle of nowhere, you wouldn't have these problems. Some of us have real lives with real responsibilities." That was the moment Sarah's patience finally snapped completely. She had tried being reasonable, she had tried being polite, she had even tried begging. But Margaret was determined to treat her like dirt, and Sarah was done with it. "You know what, Margaret? You're absolutely right. I do live out here in the middle of nowhere. And you know what else? I have 3 big dogs who live out here with me. Dogs who are very protective of their territory. Dogs who love meeting new people, especially people in fancy clothes." Margaret's confident smile faltered for just a second. "What's that supposed to mean?" Sarah smiled sweetly, using the same fake tone Margaret had been using all day. "Oh, nothing at all, Margaret. I'm just saying that things can get very interesting out here in the country, especially when city people don't understand how things work." As Sarah walked back to her house, she could feel Margaret's eyes burning into her back. But Sarah didn't care anymore. She had tried the nice way, the reasonable way, the polite way. Now it was time to try the country way. Sarah walked to the back of her property, where her 3 dogs were waiting in their pen. Rex, Luna, and Buddy could sense that something was wrong. They had been restless all day, pacing and whining as strangers invaded their territory. "Well, boys and girl," Sarah said, reaching for the latch on their pen, "I think it's time you met our visitors." Sarah stood at the gate of the dog pen, her hand resting on the metal latch. Rex, Luna, and Buddy pressed against the fence, their tails wagging as they sensed something exciting was about to happen. These 3 dogs had been Sarah's faithful companions for years, and they knew every inch of the property better than she did. Rex was the oldest and biggest of the 3. He was a German Shepherd mix with thick black and brown fur that seemed to attract every speck of dirt within a mile radius. At 85 pounds, he was gentle as a lamb with Sarah, but looked intimidating enough to make strangers think twice about causing trouble. Luna was a Rottweiler with a glossy black coat and the most expressive brown eyes Sarah had ever seen on a dog. She was smart, loyal, and had an amazing ability to read people's intentions. Luna could tell the difference between a welcome guest and an unwanted visitor from 50 yards away. Buddy was the youngest and most energetic of the group. He was an Australian cattle dog with a speckled blue and white coat that made him look like he was wearing paint splatter. Buddy lived up to his breed's reputation for being active, playful, and absolutely fearless when it came to protecting his family. All 3 dogs had been cooped up in their pen since early morning, watching strangers walk back and forth across their territory. Sarah could see the confusion and frustration in their eyes. They didn't understand why they couldn't investigate these new people who had invaded their home. "You guys have been very patient today," Sarah said, scratching Rex behind the ears. "But I think it's time you got to explore your own property again." The spring rains had been heavy that year, and Sarah's property showed it. The area near the drainage ditch that ran alongside the driveway had turned into a muddy mess. What used to be firm ground was now soft, sticky mud that squished between your toes and clung to everything it touched. The dogs absolutely loved it. Sarah had always tried to keep them away from the muddiest spots when she knew she'd have to clean them up afterward. But today was different. Today she didn't care if they got dirty. In fact, she was counting on... As she opened the gate, and the 3 dogs bounded out with excitement they had been holding back all day. They didn't run toward the house or the barn like they usually did. Instead, they headed straight for the forbidden muddy area near the drainage ditch. Rex was the first to discover the biggest mud puddle. He approached it cautiously, sniffed it, and then laid down and rolled in it like he had found a pile of gold. The thick, dark mud covered his fur, turning him from a beautiful German shepherd into something that looked like a walking mud sculpture. Luna and Buddy quickly joined him. Luna found a smaller puddle and began digging in it with her front paws, sending mud flying in all directions. Buddy, true to his energetic nature, ran from puddle to puddle, jumping and splashing like a child at a water park. Within minutes, all three dogs were completely covered in mud. It was in their fur, on their faces, between their toes, and dripping from their bellies. They looked absolutely ridiculous, and they were having the time of their lives. Sarah watched from her back porch, and for the first time all day she smiled. Her dogs were happy, they were on their own property, and they were about to give Margaret's fancy wedding guests an experience they would never forget. Around 4 p.m., the first guests began arriving for the rehearsal dinner. Sarah could hear car doors slamming and the sound of high heels clicking on pavement. She looked out her front window and saw well-dressed people walking from their cars toward Margaret's backyard. The guests were dressed to impress. The women wore elegant dresses, expensive jewelry, and shoes that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly grocery budget. The men were in tailored suits and polished leather shoes that had never seen a speck of dirt. They walked across Sarah's property like they owned it, chatting and laughing about the wedding, the food, and how lovely Margaret's house looked. None of them seemed to care that they were trespassing on private property or that their cars had ruined someone's entire day. Sarah's 3 muddy dogs were playing near the drainage ditch when they heard the voices. Their ears perked up, and they looked toward the driveway with interest. New people meant new friends to meet, and after being cooped up all day, they were eager for some social interaction. Rex was the first to notice the guests. He lifted his massive mud-covered head and saw a woman in a white dress walking carefully between the cars. His tail began to wag, sending drops of mud flying in all directions. In his mind, this was wonderful. A new person to meet and greet. Luna and Buddy quickly joined Rex in watching the parade of fancy people. To them, these weren't trespassers or unwanted guests. These were potential new friends who might want to play, get belly rubs, or maybe even throw a stick. The first guest to encounter the dogs was Mrs. Patterson, Margaret's elderly aunt. She was wearing a cream-colored pantsuit and carrying a small beaded purse. She was walking slowly and carefully, trying not to trip on the uneven gravel driveway. Rex saw her and immediately trotted over to say hello. He was wagging his tail and had what Sarah called his friendly face on. To Rex, this was just another person to meet. He had no idea that his muddy paws and wet fur were about to cause chaos. Mrs. Patterson saw the large, mud-covered dog approaching and let out a small scream. Oh my goodness, where did this dirty dog come from? Rex, thinking her raised voice meant she was excited to see him, picked up his pace. He reached Mrs. Patterson and did what he always did when meeting new people. He put his front paws on her shoulders to give her a proper greeting. The result was immediate and dramatic. Rex's muddy paws left perfect prints on Mrs. Patterson's cream pantsuit. His wet fur brushed against her arms, leaving streaks of mud on her sleeves. His enthusiastic tail wagging sprayed mud drops across her face and hair. Mrs. Patterson stumbled backward, trying to get away from the friendly but filthy dog. She bumped into Mr. Chen, Margaret's neighbor, who was wearing an expensive navy suit. The collision caused them both to lose their balance, and they grabbed onto each other for support. Luna and Buddy, hearing the commotion, decided to join the fun. They bounded over to see what was happening, their tails wagging and their tongues hanging out. To them, this looked like a great game that everyone was playing. Luna reached the group first and immediately began sniffing Mrs. Patterson's purse, which had fallen to the ground. Her wet nose left streaks on the beaded surface. Buddy, not wanting to be left out, jumped up on Mr. Chen's legs, leaving muddy paw prints on his perfectly pressed pants. More guests were arriving, and they all had to walk through the same area to reach Margaret's backyard. Sarah watched from her window as guest after guest encountered her 3 enthusiastic, muddy dogs. The dogs weren't being mean or aggressive. They were just being dogs. They wanted to meet everyone, smell everyone, and maybe get some attention from these interesting new people. The fact that they were covered in mud was just an unfortunate detail that made their friendly greetings much more memorable. Sarah could hear voices getting louder and more upset. She heard someone yell, "Get this dirty dog away from me," and another person shout, Where is the owner of these animals? Through her window, Sarah could see the chaos unfolding. Her 3 dogs were having the time of their lives, meeting new people and sharing their muddy joy with everyone they encountered. The wedding guests, on the other hand, were discovering that fancy clothes and farm dogs don't mix very well. Margaret's perfect rehearsal dinner was about to become much more interesting than anyone had planned. Within 30 minutes, Sarah's front yard looked like a disaster zone. The elegant wedding guests who had arrived looking like they stepped out of a fashion magazine were now covered in mud from head to toe. Rex, Luna, and Buddy were having the absolute best day of their lives, greeting every single person with enthusiastic tail wags and muddy paw prints. The first major incident happened when Dr. Williams, Margaret's family dentist, tried to shoo Rex away from his brand new Mercedes. Dr. Williams was a proud man who wore expensive suits and always looked perfectly groomed. He had paid extra to get his car detailed that morning, and now there was a massive muddy German shepherd sniffing around it with great interest. "Get away from my car, you filthy animal," Dr. Williams shouted, waving his hands at Rex. Rex thought this was an invitation to play. He began jumping up and down, his muddy paws leaving prints all over Dr. Williams's silver suit jacket. The more Dr. Williams yelled and waved his arms, the more excited Rex became. Soon, Rex was practically dancing around the man, covering him in mud with every bounce. Luna, meanwhile, had discovered Mrs. Henderson's sister visiting from California. The woman was wearing a flowing white dress that she had bought specifically for the wedding weekend. She stood frozen in terror as Luna approached, sniffing curiously at the fancy fabric. "Nice doggy," the woman whispered, trying not to move. "Please don't jump on me." But Luna was curious about this new person. She circled around the woman, her wet, muddy coat brushing against the white dress with each pass. Dark brown streaks appeared on the pristine fabric like paint strokes on a canvas. When Luna finally decided to give the woman a proper greeting by putting her paws on her waist, the white dress was transformed into modern art. Buddy, the most energetic of the 3 dogs, had found his own entertainment. He had discovered that the fancy guests made interesting noises when he shook his wet coat near them. So he developed a game where he would run up to someone, shake vigorously to spray mud in all directions, and then run to the next person to repeat the performance. His first victim was Judge Morrison, a stern man who presided over the county courthouse. The judge was wearing his best black suit and had been bragging to other guests about how it was custom-made by a tailor in New York City. Buddy ran up to him and shook his entire body like he was coming out of a lake. Mud flew everywhere. Judge Morrison's expensive suit was instantly decorated with brown spots of various sizes. His white shirt looked like it had been attacked by a paintbrush. His face was splattered with mud drops, and his perfectly combed hair now had clumps of dirt hanging from it. "What in the blazes?" Judge Morrison shouted, trying to wipe mud from his eyes. "Someone control these wild animals." But the dogs weren't wild. They were friendly, happy, and completely oblivious to the fact that they were destroying hundreds of dollars worth of clothing with each greeting. To them, these were just new friends who seemed very excited to meet them, based on all the shouting and arm-waving. The situation got even worse when the caterers arrived with the food for the rehearsal dinner. They had to carry trays of expensive appetizers and decorations from their van, parked on the street, to Margaret's backyard. This meant walking through the war zone that Sarah's driveway had become. The first caterer, a young woman named Lisa, was carrying a tray of fancy hors d'oeuvres when she encountered Rex. She tried to hold the tray high above her head to keep it away from the muddy dog, but Rex was tall enough to reach it with his nose. He sniffed the interesting smells and accidentally knocked the tray with his snout. Dozens of expensive appetizers went flying through the air and landed in the mud. Shrimp cocktail, stuffed mushrooms, and fancy cheese cubes were scattered across the ground like confetti. Rex and Buddy immediately began investigating this unexpected feast, their tails wagging with joy. The second caterer, an older man named Frank, saw what happened and tried to run past the dogs with his tray. But Luna was faster. She intercepted him near the biggest mud puddle and jumped up to see what delicious things he was carrying. The impact sent Frank stumbling backward into the puddle with a splash that could be heard from Margaret's backyard. Frank sat in the mud, covered from head to toe in dark brown muck, while expensive wedding cake samples floated in the puddle around him. His white chef's coat was now the color of chocolate, and his hat had fallen off and was sinking into the mud like a ship. By 5:30 p.m., the scene was absolute chaos. Wedding guests were standing around in small groups, all of them covered in varying degrees of mud. Some were crying, some were laughing in shock. Others were trying to call their dry cleaners to see if their clothes could be saved. Mrs. Patterson, Margaret's aunt, was sitting on the hood of someone's car, her cream pantsuit now looking like camouflage gear. She was fanning herself with her muddy purse and muttering, "In my 50 years of attending weddings, I have never seen anything like this." Dr. Williams had given up trying to stay clean and was now attempting to wash mud off his car windows with a bottle of water he found in his trunk. His silver suit jacket was hanging on his car's antenna, dripping mud onto the gravel below. Judge Morrison was standing near the street, trying to use his cell phone to call anyone who could help with this situation. But his phone screen was covered in muddy fingerprints and he couldn't see the numbers clearly enough to dial. The dogs, meanwhile, were having the time of their lives. They had met more new people in 1 hour than they usually met in a month. Every person had given them attention, even if that attention involved a lot of shouting and arm-waving. As far as Rex, Luna, and Buddy were concerned, this was the best party they had ever attended. Sarah watched the chaos from her kitchen window, drinking a cup of tea and feeling satisfied for the first time all day. Her animals had finally been fed after she managed to climb over the fence and reach the barn through the back of her property. She had called Dr. Martinez and explained that she might be able to make it to work after all, once the cars were moved. But the real entertainment was just beginning. Through her window, Sarah could see Margaret's perfectly styled hair appearing around the corner of her house. Margaret was coming to investigate the screaming and shouting that was disturbing her elegant rehearsal dinner. Sarah smiled and took another sip of her tea. Margaret was about to meet her 3 muddy ambassadors, and Sarah had a feeling that conversation was going to be very different from their chat that morning. The dogs had been waiting all day to meet the person who had caused all this trouble, and they were about to give Margaret the greeting she deserved. Margaret Henderson appeared around the corner of her house like a storm cloud ready to explode. Her perfectly styled hair was still in place, her makeup was flawless, and her expensive blue dress didn't have a single wrinkle. She looked like she was ready for a magazine photo shoot, which made the muddy chaos in Sarah's driveway even more dramatic by comparison. "What in the world is going on out here?" Margaret shrieked, taking in the scene before her. Her wedding guests were scattered around the driveway like survivors of a natural disaster. Every single person was covered in mud to some degree, and her carefully planned rehearsal dinner was falling apart before it had even begun. Rex, Luna, and Buddy heard Margaret's voice and immediately turned their attention to this new person. They had been waiting all day to meet the woman who seemed to be in charge of all these interesting visitors. Their tails began wagging with excitement as they trotted toward her. Margaret saw the 3 large, muddy dogs approaching and took several quick steps backward. "Stay away from me, you filthy animals," she screamed, pointing her finger at them like she was casting a spell. But the dogs didn't understand commands from strangers. They only listened to Sarah, and Sarah was nowhere to be seen. To Rex, Luna, and Buddy, Margaret looked like just another guest who needed a proper welcome to their property. Rex reached Margaret first. He was still dripping with mud from his adventures in the drainage ditch, and his thick fur was caked with brown muck. He approached Margaret with his usual friendly demeanor, tail wagging and tongue hanging out in a doggy smile. "Don't you dare come near me," Margaret shouted, backing up toward her own house. But Rex was persistent. He had greeted everyone else, and he wasn't about to skip the woman who seemed to be the guest of honor. Margaret tried to run, but her high heels weren't made for quick escapes on gravel driveways. She stumbled slightly, and that moment of unsteadiness was all Rex needed. He bounded forward and jumped up to greet her properly, placing his massive muddy paws right on the front of her pristine blue dress. The result was instant and spectacular. 2 perfect paw prints appeared on Margaret's chest, dark brown against the light blue fabric. Rex's enthusiasm caused him to wiggle while his paws were on her dress, creating smeared streaks of mud that looked like abstract art. "No!" Margaret screamed, pushing at Rex with both hands. But pushing only made things worse. Now her hands were covered in mud from Rex's wet fur, and she was spreading it to other parts of her dress as she tried to get him off. Luna and Buddy, hearing all the excitement, decided to join the welcome party. Luna approached from Margaret's left side while Buddy came around from the right. They moved like a coordinated team, though they had no idea they were trapping Margaret between them. Margaret spun around, trying to keep all three dogs away from her at the same time, but spinning in high heels on loose gravel while three excited dogs danced around her was like trying to balance on a tightrope during an earthquake. "Someone help me," Margaret yelled to her muddy guests, but everyone was too busy dealing with their own muddy situations to come to her rescue. Dr. Williams was still trying to clean his car. Judge Morrison was attempting to wipe mud from his phone. Mrs. Patterson was sitting on a car hood looking like she was in shock. Buddy, always the most energetic of the three dogs, decided to show Margaret his favorite trick. He ran in a circle around her, then stopped suddenly and shook his entire body as hard as he could. Mud flew off his coat like water from a sprinkler, covering Margaret from head to toe in tiny brown drops. Margaret's perfectly styled hair now had mud specks throughout it. Her flawless makeup was decorated with brown freckles. Her expensive dress looked like it had been attacked by a mud-filled paintball gun. "This is outrageous," Margaret screamed, her voice getting higher and more hysterical. "These vicious animals are attacking me. Someone call animal control. I'm going to sue." For everything she's worth, Sarah's kitchen door opened and she stepped outside for the first time since the chaos began. She was wearing clean jeans and a simple t-shirt, looking calm and collected compared to everyone else in the driveway. "Is there a problem out here?" Sarah asked in a sweet, innocent voice. "I heard shouting." Margaret whirled around to face Sarah, mud flying from her hair with the movement. "Your vicious dogs attacked me. Look what they did to my dress. This is assault. This is property damage. I'm calling the police." Sarah looked around at the muddy wedding guests, then at her three dogs who were now sitting politely in a row, their tongues hanging out and their tails wagging. They looked proud of themselves for greeting so many new people in one day. "I'm sorry, Margaret, but I don't see any attacks," Sarah said calmly. "I see three dogs on their own property, greeting visitors who parked on their land without permission. Dogs tend to do that, you know. They get excited when strangers invade their territory. They're covered in mud. They ruined everyone's clothes." "Well, yes, they are muddy," Sarah agreed. "It has been raining a lot lately, and dogs do love to play in puddles. Maybe if people didn't park on private property and walk across someone else's land, they wouldn't have encountered muddy farm dogs." Judge Morrison, who had been listening to the conversation while trying to clean his phone, spoke up. "Actually, Mrs. Henderson, the dogs are on their own property, and technically we've all been trespassing." Margaret's face turned red with rage. "How dare you take her side? These are vicious animals. They should be put down." That comment was the wrong thing to say in front of Sarah. Her calm demeanor disappeared instantly, replaced by the protective fury of someone whose family had been threatened. "Ma'am," Sarah said, her voice deadly quiet, "these dogs have never hurt anyone in their lives. They greeted your guests the same way they greet everyone, with enthusiasm and affection. If you ever threaten my dogs again, you'll discover that I can be much less friendly than they are." Margaret looked around at her muddy guests, her ruined rehearsal dinner, and her mud-covered dress. She realized that she had lost this battle completely. Her attempt to use Sarah's property without permission had backfired in the most humiliating way possible. "Fine," Margaret screeched. "Everyone move your cars, we're leaving." The muddy wedding guests didn't need to be told twice. They stumbled toward their vehicles, leaving brown handprints on every surface they touched. Car doors slammed, engines started, and within 15 minutes Sarah's driveway was finally empty. As the last car drove away, Sarah looked down at Rex, Luna, and Buddy. All three dogs looked up at her with expressions that seemed to say, "Did we do good?" "You did perfect," Sarah said, scratching each dog behind the ears. "Absolutely perfect." The rehearsal dinner continued that evening, but it wasn't quite the elegant affair Margaret had planned. Half the guests had to go back to their hotels to change clothes, and the other half spent the evening trying to clean mud out of their hair. The story of Margaret's muddy rehearsal dinner spread through the neighborhood faster than gossip at a church social. Everyone heard about how the HOA president's entitled attitude had been defeated by 3 friendly farm dogs who were just being themselves. From that day forward, no one ever parked in Sarah's driveway without asking permission. First, Margaret moved away 3 months later, claiming she needed to live somewhere more civilized. Sarah never had another neighbor problem, and Rex, Luna, and Buddy became local legends. The 3 muddy heroes who taught an entire wedding party about respect, boundaries, and the consequences of entitled behavior. They had solved Sarah's problem without being mean, aggressive, or harmful. They had simply been dogs, doing what dogs do best, protecting their family and their territory, with love, enthusiasm, and a whole lot of mud.